Greetings everyone, Gleekon here again with another episode of Lore of Warcraft. We left off on our last episode with Marisa and Falstad making their way deeper with the help of Krasis and the little amulet, and they caught sight of the goblin Krill, but they haven't reunited with Rhonin yet. So stay a while and listen to this one. It's chapter 18 of the novel, The Day of the Dragon. Too slow. They were much too slow. Necros shoved a peon forward with an angry grunt, urging the worthless lower caste orc to quicker work. The other orc cringed, then scurried off with his burden. The lower caste orcs were useless for anything but menial labor, and right now Necros found them wanting even in that one skill. As it was, he had been forced to make the warriors work alongside them in order to get everything accomplished by dawn. Necros had actually considered leaving in the dead of night, but that had no longer been possible, and he certainly had not wanted to wait another day. Each day no doubt brought invasion nearer, although his scouts, clearly blind to reality, insisted that they so far had found no more traces of an advanced force, much less an army. Never mind that Alliance warriors on griffins had already been sighted. A wizard had found his way into the mountain, and the most dire of all dragons now served the enemy. Simply because the scouts could not see them did not mean that the humans and their allies were not already nearing Grim Batal. Still in the midst of trying to get the menials to understand the urgency of their packing, the maimed orc did not at first notice his chief handler come up. Only when he heard an uncomfortable clearing of the throat did Necros turn.
"Speak, Brogas. Why do you skulk like one of these wretches?"
The slightly stout younger orc grimaced. His tusks tended to turn down at the sides, giving his already frowning face an even more dour look.
"The male, Necros. I think he dies soon."
More bad news and some of the worst possible.
"Let's see this."
They hurried as fast as they could, Brogus carefully maintaining a pace that would not make his superior's handicap more evident. Necros, however, had greater concerns on his mind. In order to continue the breeding program, he needed a female and a male. Without one or the other, he had nothing, and Zulahed would not like that. They came at last to the cavern in which had been housed the eldest and only surviving consort of Alexstrasza. Tiranastrasz had surely been a most impressive sight when compared to other dragons. Necros gathered that at one point the old Crimson male had even rivaled Deathwing in size and power, although perhaps that had simply been legend. Nonetheless, the consort still filled the massive chamber quite ably, so much so that at first the orc leader could not believe that such a giant could possibly be ill. And if you remember, he did make an appearance in the War of the Ancients trilogy. Yet the moment he heard the dragon's unsteady breathing, he knew the truth. Tyran, as all called him, had suffered several seizures in the past year. The orc had once assumed that dragons were immortal, only dying when slain in battle, but he had discovered over time that they had other limitations, such as disease. Something within this venerable behemoth had stricken Tyran with a slow but fatal ailment.
"How long has the beast been like that?"
Brogus swallowed.
"Since last night, on and off. But he looked better a few hours ago."
Necros whirled on his handler.
"Fool! Should have told me sooner."
He almost struck the other orc, then considered how useless it would have been to have had the knowledge. He had suspected for some time he would lose the elder dragon, but had just not wanted to admit it.
"What do we do, Necros? Zulahed will be furious. Our skulls will sit atop poles."
Necros frowned. He too had conjured up that image in his mind, and not liked it one bit, of course.
"We've no choice. Get him prepared for moving. He comes dead or alive. Let Zulahed do what he will." "But Necros!"
Now the one-legged orc did strike his subordinate.
"Simpering fool! Obey orders!"
Subdued, Brogus nodded and rushed off, no doubt to beat the lesser handlers while they worked to fulfill Necros' commands. Yes, Tyran would be coming with the rest whether or not he still breathed. At the very least, he would serve as a decoy. Taking a step nearer, Necros studied the great male in detail. The mottled scales, the inconsistent breathing, the lack of movement. No, Alexstrasza's consort did not have long left in the world.
"Necros,"
mumbled the Dragon Queen's voice suddenly.
"Necros, I smell you near."
Willing to use any excuse to not think of what Tyran's passing might mean to his own skin, the heavy-set orc made his way to the female's chamber. As his usual precaution, he reached into his belt pouch and kept one hand on the demon soul. Through slitted eyes, Alexstrasza watched him enter. She too had seemed somewhat ill of late, but Necros refused to believe that he would lose her too. More likely she knew that her last consort might soon be dead. Necros wished one of the other two had survived. They had been much younger, more virile than Tyran.
"What now, O Queen?"
"Necros,
Why do you persist in this madness?
He grunted.
Is that all you wanted of me, female? I've more important things to do than answer your silly questions.
The dragon snorted.
And all your efforts will only lead to your death. You have the chance to save yourself and your men, but you will not take it. We're not craven, backstabbing scum like Orgrim Doomhammer. Dragon Maw clan fights to the bloody end, even if it be our own. Trying to flee to the north, that is how you fight.
Necros Skullcrusher brought out the demon soul.
There are things you don't even know, Ancient One. There are times when flight leads to fight.
Alexstrasza sighed.
There is no getting through to you, is there, Necros? At last you learn. Tell me this, then. What were you doing in Tyran's chamber? What ails him now?
Both the dragon's eyes and tone of voice were filled with her concern for her consort.
Nothing for you to worry your head about, O Queen. Better to think of yourself. We'll be moving you soon. Behave, and it'll be much more painless.
With that said, he pocketed the demon soul and left her. The Dragon Queen called his name once, no doubt to again implore him to tell her about the health of her mate, but Necros could no longer spend time worrying about dragons, at least not red ones. Even though the column would likely leave Grimbatal before the Alliance invaders reached it, the Orc commander knew with absolute certainty that one creature would still arrive in time to wreak havoc. Deathwing would come. The Black Leviathan would be there come the morning, if only because of one thing. Alexstrasza. The Black Dragon would come for his rival.
Let them all come,
snarled the Orc to himself.
All of them! All I need is for the Dark One to be first.
He patted the pouch where he kept the demon soul.
And then Deathwing will do the rest.
Consciousness returned to Rhonin, albeit barely at first. Yet even as weakened as he felt, the wizard immediately remained still, recalling what had happened to him the last time. He did not want the golem sending him back to oblivion, especially since Rhonin feared that this time he would not come back. He's been spending a lot of time unconscious lately in this book. As his strength returned, the imprisoned spellcaster cautiously opened his eyes. The fiery golem was nowhere to be seen. Stunned, Rhonin lifted his head, eyes opening wide. No sooner had he done this when suddenly the very air before him flared and hundreds of minute balls of fire exploded into being. The fiery orbs swirled around, quickly combining, forming a vaguely humanoid shape that sharpened in the space of a breath. The massive golem reformed in all its grotesque glory. Expecting the worst, Rhonin lowered his head, shutting his eyes at the same time. He waited for the magical creature's horrific touch and waited. And waited. At last, when curiosity finally got the better of his fear, the wary mage slowly, carefully opened one eye, just enough to see. The golem had vanished again. So, Rhonin remained under its watchful gaze, even if he now could not see it. Necros clearly played games with him, although perhaps Krill had somehow arranged this latest trickery. The wizard's hopes faded. Perhaps it would be better this way. After all, had he not thought that his death might better serve those who had died because of him? Would that not at last satisfy his own feelings of guilt? Unable to do anything else, Rhonin hung there, paying no attention to the passage of minutes nor the continual sounds of the orcs finishing their preparations for departure. When he chose to, Necros would return and either take the wizard with him, or more likely question Rhonin one last time before executing him. And Rhonin could do nothing. At some point after he closed his eyes again, weariness took hold and led him into a more gentle slumber. Rhonin dreamed of many things: dragons, ghouls, dwarves, and Verisa. Dreaming of the elf soothed some of his troubled thoughts. He had known her only a short time, but more and more he found her face popping up in his thoughts. In another time and place, perhaps he could have gotten to know her better. The elf became the center point of his dreaming, so much so that Rhonin could even hear her voice. She called his name over and over, at first longingly, then, when he did not reply, with more urgency. Rhonin. Her voice grew distant, just a whisper now, yet somehow it also seemed to have more substance to it. Rhonin. This time her call actually stirred him from his dreams, pulled him from his slumber. Rhonin fought at first, having no desire at all to return to the reality of a cell and his imminent death. He doesn't answer, muttered another voice, not at all as soft and musical as Verisa's. The wizard vaguely recognized it, and the knowledge brought him further toward a waking state. Perhaps that is now how they can keep him secure with only chains and no bars, the elf replied. It looks as if you told the truth.
I would not lie to you, kind mistress. I would not lie to you.
And that last shrill voice did what the other two could not. Ronan threw aside the last vestiges of sleep and just barely kept himself from shouting out.
Let's get this done, then,
Falstad the dwarf muttered. The footsteps that followed indicated immediately to the wizard that the dwarf and others headed toward him. He opened his eyes. Verisa and Falstad did indeed enter the chamber, the elf's arresting visage full of concern. The ranger had her sword drawn, and around her neck she wore what almost looked like the medallion Deathwing had given Rhonin, save that this one had a stone of crimson where the other had been as black as the soul of the sinister Leviathan. Beside her, the dwarf had his hammer sheathed on his back. For a weapon, he carried a long dagger, the tip of which presently touched the throat of a snarling krill. The sight of the first two, especially Verisa, filled Rhonin with hope. Behind the tiny rescue party, the fire golem reformed in complete silence.
Look out!
The dismayed wizard shouted, his voice raspy from so many previous screams. Verisa and Falstad dropped to the opposing sides as the monstrous skeletal figure reached for them. Tossed by the dwarf, Krill slid toward the very wall where Rhonin had been chained. The goblin swore he bounced hard against the rock. Falstad rose first, throwing his dagger at the golem, who completely ignored the blade that clattered against the bony armor. Then, pulling free his storm hammer, he swung at the inhuman sentinel even as Verisa leapt to her feet to join in the attack. Still weak, Rhonin could not do anything at the moment but watch. The ranger and the dwarf came at their fiendish adversary from opposing directions, trying to force the golem into a fatal mistake. Unfortunately, Rhonin doubted that they could even slay the creature by mortal means. Falstad's first swing pushed the monster back a step, but on the second one the golem seized hold of the upper handle. The griffin rider became embroiled in a horrible tug-of-war as the golem tried to pull him toward it.
The hands!
The mage gasped.
Watch the hands!
Burning, fleshless fingers grabbed for Falstad as he came within range. The desperate dwarf let go of his precious hammer, tumbling out of immediate reach of his foe. Verisa darted forward, thrusting. Her elven blade did little against the macabre armor, which easily deflected it. The golem turned toward her, then threw the storm hammer in her direction. The ranger nimbly leapt aside, but now she found herself the only one with any sort of defense against the inhuman guard. Oh, it's a fly. There's like a little tiny gnat, and my dog's gonna hunt it down. The golem turned toward her, then threw... Oh. Verisa thrust twice more, nearly losing her blade the second time. The golem, apparently impervious to edged weapons, attempted with each attack to seize the sword by the blade. His friends were losing, and Rhonin had done nothing to help. It only grew worse. Having regained his balance, Falstad started for his hammer. The mouth of the ghoulish warrior opened incredibly wide. A fearsome spout of black fire nearly engulfed Falstad. Only at the last did he manage to roll away, but not before his clothing had been singed. That left Verisa alone in the direct path of the golem. Frustration tore at Rhonin. She would die if he did nothing. They all would die if he did nothing. He had to free himself. Summoning his strength as best he could, the battered spellcaster called up a spell. With the golem occupied, Rhonin had the chance to concentrate on his efforts. All he needed was a moment more. Success! The shackles holding his limbs burst open, clattering against the rocky wall. Gasping, Rhonin stretched his arms once, then focused on the golem. A heavy weight struck him on the upper back. An intense pressure on Rhonin's throat cut off all air.
Naughty, naughty wizard! Don't you know you're supposed to die?
Krill had a hold around Rhonin's throat that stunned the wizard completely. He had known that goblins were far stronger than they appeared, but Krill's might bordered on the fantastic.
That's it, human. Give in. Fall to your knees.
Rhonin almost wanted to do just that. The lack of air had his mind spinning, and that, coupled with the tortures he had suffered at the hands of the golem, nearly did him in. Yet if he fell, so too would Verisa and Falstad. Concentrating, he reached a hand back to the murderous goblin. With a high shriek, Krill released his hold and dropped to the floor. Rhonin fell against the wall, trying to get his breath back and hoping that Krill would not take advantage of his weakness. He need not have worried. Burned on his arm, the goblin hopped away from Rhonin, cursing.
Foul, foul, wizard! Damn your magic ways! We'll leave you to my friend here. Leave you to feel his tender touch.
Krill hopped toward the exit, laughing darkly at the intruder's fate. The golem paused in his struggle with Verisa and the dwarf, his deathly gaze shifting to the escaping Krill. His jaws opened. A burst of ebony fire shot forth from the skeletal maw, completely enveloping the unsuspecting goblin. With a mercifully short cry, Krill perished in a ball of flame, so quickly incinerated by the magical fire that only ash drifted to the floor. Ash and the ruined medallion the goblin had carried in his belt pouch.
"He slew the little wretch,"
Falstad marveled. "And we are certain to be next," reminded the elf. "Even though I feel no heat, my blade is half turned to slag from the flames surrounding his body, and I doubt I can dodge him much longer."
"Aye, if I could get my hammer, I might be able to do something, but look out!"
Again the golem unleashed a blast, but this time at the ceiling. The furious column of flame did more than heat the rock, though. As it struck, the flame shattered the ceiling, sending massive chunks down on the trio. One caught Verisa on the arm, hitting with such violence that the ranger dropped to the floor. The torrent forced Falstad away from her and prevented Rhonin from even trying to make any move in her direction. The fiery golem focused on the fallen elf. The jaws opened again. "No!" Utilizing raw will, Rhonin countered, throwing up a shield as powerful as any he had ever created. The dark flames struck the invisible barrier with their full fury and rebounded back at the golem. Rhonin would not have expected the creature's own weapon to have any effect on it, but the flames not only took hold of their wielder, they coursed over him with hunger. A roar erupted from the golem's fleshless throat, an ungodly, inhuman roar. The monstrous creature quivered, then exploded, unleashing magical forces of hurricane proportion into the tiny mountain chamber. Unable to withstand those forces, what remained of the ceiling collapsed atop the defenders. In the dark of the night, the dragon Deathwing flew east across the sea. Swifter than the wind, he headed toward Cosmodon, and more significantly, Grimbatal. The dragon actually smiled to himself, a sight that any other creature would have turned from in mortal terror. All went as intended in every venture. His plans for the humans had moved along so very smoothly. Why, just hours ago he had received a missive from Tyrannus outlining just how just a week after Lord Prester's coronation, word would go out that the new monarch of Alterac would be wedding the King of Lordaeron's young daughter the day she turned of age. Just a few scant years, the blink of an eye in the life of a dragon, and he would be in place to set about the annihilation of the humans. After them, the elves and dwarves, older and without the vigor of humanity, would fall like the leaves on a dying tree. He would savor those days well, come the future. Now, however, Deathwing attended to a more immediate and even more gratifying situation. The orcs prepared to abandon their mountain fortress. By dawn, they would be moving the wagons out, heading for the Horde's last stronghold in Dun El Gaz. With them would go the dragons. The orcs expected an alliance invasion from the west. At the very least, they expected griffin riders and wizards, and one black giant. Deathwing had no intention of disappointing Necro's Skullcrusher on that account. From Krill, he knew that the one-legged orc had something in mind. The dragon looked forward to seeing what folly the puny creature planned. He suspected he knew, but it would be interesting to find out if an orc could have an original thought for a change. The dim outline of Cosmodon's shore came up on the horizon. Better equipped to see in the dark, Deathwing banked slightly, heading more to the north. Only a couple of hours remained until sunrise. He would have plenty of time to reach his chosen perch. From there, the dragon would be able to watch and wait, choose just the right moment, alter the course of the future. Another dragon flew, too, a dragon who had not flown in many years. The sensations of unfettered flight thrilled him, yet they also served to remind just how out of practice he had become. What should have been completely natural, what should have been an inherent part of his very being, seemed out of place. Corielstrasz the dragon had been Krasis the wizard for far too long. Had it been daylight already, those who would have witnessed his passing would have noted a dragon of great, if not gargantuan, proportions, larger than most, but certainly not one of the 5 aspects. A brilliant, blood-red, and sleek of form, in his youth Corielstrasz had been considered quite handsome for his kind. Certainly he had caught the eye of his queen. Swift, deadly, and quick of thought in battle, the Crimson Giant had also been among her greatest defenders, protecting the honor of the flight and becoming her foremost servant when it came to dealing with the new upcoming races. Even before the capture of his beloved Alexstrasza, he had spent most of his later years in the form of the wizard Krasis, generally only reverting to his true self when secretly visiting her. As one of her younger consorts, he had not held the position of authority that Tyrannostrasz had, but Corielstrasz had known that he had yet held a special place in the heart of his queen. That had been why he had volunteered in the first place to be her primary agent among the most promising and diverse of the new races, humanity, helping to guide it to maturity whenever possible. Alexstrasza no doubt thought him dead. After her capture and the subjugation of the rest of the dragonflight, he had seen his own subterfuge as the only way to continue the struggle, return fully to the guise of Krasis and aid the Alliance in its war against the Orcs. It had disheartened him to have to assist in the death of his own blood, but the young drakes raised by the Horde knew little of their kind's past glory, rarely ever living long enough to grow out of their bloodlust and begin to learn the wisdom that had ever truly been a dragon's legacy. In aiding the elf and dwarf in their bid for entry into the mountain, he had been fortunate enough to speak into the mind of one of those youngsters, calming the drake and explaining what had to be done. That the other dragon had listened had been heartening. Some hope remained for at least one, but so much still had to be done, enough so that once more Coriolstraz had turned his back on the mortals and left them to their own devices. The moment he had viewed the wagons through the medallion, heard the barked order from the orc officers, he had realized that all for which he had struggled was about to come to fruition. The orcs had taken the bait and were departing from Grim Batal. They would be moving his beloved Alexstrasza into the open, where he could at last rescue her. Even then it would not be simple. It would require guile, timing, and of course, pure luck. That Deathwing lived and clearly plotted the downfall of the Lordaeron Alliance had presented itself as a new and terrible concern, one that had for a time threatened the upheaval of everything for which Coriolstraz had planned. Yet from what he had discovered as Krasis, it seemed that Deathwing had become too immersed in the politics of the Alliance to even concern himself with the distant orcs and what remained of the once proud Red Flight of Dragons. No, Deathwing played his own game of chess with the various kingdoms as pieces. Left to his own devices, he would surely cause war and devastation among them. Fortunately, such a game required years, and so Coriolstraz felt little concern for the humans back in Lordaeron and beyond. Their situation could wait until he had freed his beloved. However, if the fleet dragon could ignore the growing threat to the very lands he had taken under his wing, one other matter still gnawed at his thoughts until he could ignore it no longer. Rhonin and the two who had gone in search of him had trusted in Krasis the wizard, not knowing that to Coriolstraz the dragon the rescue of his queen meant more than life itself. The lives of 3 mortals had seemed of very little consequence in comparison to that, or so he had thought until recently. Guilt racked the dragon. Guilt not only for his betrayal of Rhonin, but also his neglect of the elf and the dwarf after promising to guide them inside. Rhonin had likely been slain some time ago, but perhaps it was not too late to save the other 2. The Crimson Leviathan knew that he would not be able to concentrate on his quest until he had at least satisfied himself with doing what he could for them. On the very tip of southwestern Cosmodon, only a few hours from Ironforge, Coriolstraz picked out a secluded peak in the midst of the mountain chain there and alighted. He took a few moments to orient himself, then shut his eyes and focused on the medallion that he had made Rom give to the Ranger Verisa. Although she likely thought the stone in the center only a gem, it was in fact a very part of the dragon. Fashioned through magic into its present form, it had begun its existence as one of his scales. The ensorcelled scale bore properties that would have astounded any mage, if they had known how to cast dragon magic. Fortunately for Coriolstraz, few did, else he would not have risked creating the medallion in the first place. Both Rom and the elf clearly believed the gem only useful for communication purposes, and the dragon had no intention of correcting their misconceptions. And if you remember from the War of the Ancients trilogy, they do some intense dragon magic using the scales. As the wind howled and snow buffeted the great behemoth, Coriolstraz folded his wings near his head, the better to shield it while he concentrated. He pictured the elf as he had seen her through the talisman, pleasant to look at for one of her kind, and clearly concerned for Rhonin. A very capable warrior, too. Yes, perhaps she still lived, her and the dwarf from the Ares. From the Ares? That's interesting.
Verisa Windrunner,
He quietly called.
Verisa Windrunner.
Coriolstraz closed his eyes, trying to focus his inner sight. Curiously, he could see nothing. The medallion should have enabled him to see whatever the elf pointed it toward. Had she hidden it from view?
Verisa Windrunner, make some sound, however slight, to acknowledge that you hear me.
Still nothing.
Elf!
For the first time, the dragon nearly lost his composure.
Elf!
And still no reply, no image. Coriolstraz focused his full concentration on the medallion, trying to listen for any sound, even the snarls of an orc. Nothing. Too late. His sudden act of conscience had come too late to save Rhonin's rescuers, and now they, too, had perished because of the dragon's lack of thought. As Krasis, he had played on Rhonin's guilt, played on the memories of those companions that the wizard had lost during his previous mission. It had made Rhonin quite malleable. Now, however, he began to understand just how the human had felt. Alexstrasza had always talked of the younger races in tones of caring, of nurturing, as if they too were her children. That care she had infected her consort with, and as Krasis, he had worked hard to see to it that the humans matured properly. However, his queen's capture by the orcs had shaken his thinking to its very foundations and caused Corielstrass to forget her teachings. Until now. Yet it had still come much too late for these three.
But it is not too late for you, my queen,
The dragon rumbled. Should he survive this, he would dedicate his life to making up for his failure to Rhonin and the others. For now, though, all that mattered was the rescue of his mate. She would understand, he hoped. Spreading his wings wide, the majestic red dragon took to the air, heading north to Grim Batal. All right, and I think we also still are going to have, in these last few chapters, because I think we have about 3 left, the other dragon aspects are going to join in. Probably one of them, if I'm going to guess, in the next 1 to 2 chapters, we're going to have a mega long chapter. All right, so we got this episode in the pipe 5x5. I thank you all, as always, so much for listening and watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. And I'll see you next time on Lore of Warcraft.